Imagine a military campaign where your chances of survival are less than 50-50.
I gotcha.
It's almost unfathomable, isn't it? Can't believe I said that word. Well, that was the situation for some British units that deployed to the West Indies during the French Revolutionary Wars. So why was it so deadly? Let's find out. I recently interviewed historian Steve Brown here on the show, and he talked us through General Sir Charles Grey's battles in the West Indies in 1794. It was a small campaign, but the death rate was horrific, probably the most deadly in British military history in terms of the percentage of soldiers engaged who died. Just to try and put it into perspective, during World War I, British and Empire military deaths from all causes was, according to the Encyclopaedia Britannica, 908,000 men, out of a total of around 9 million who were mobilised. Now, I'm no mathematician, but that means about 1 in 10 of those in uniform died, either in combat or from disease, etc. Horrific numbers for sure, and on a much greater scale than the West Indies campaign. But the fact remains that you were more likely to survive the Western Front in World War I than you would have been serving in the West Indies during the French Revolutionary Wars. Let's hear more from Steve.
Grey landed with 6,500 men, and he got about 500 reinforcements during the campaign. So you could say he had 7,000 men. By the end of the campaign, of that 7,000, over 5,000 were dead, and about 200 of those were from battle casualties. Of his serving officers, 27 were killed in action and 170 died of fever. And if you have a look at the individual regiments that served under him, 39th Foot lost 15 out of 32 officers. And when I say lost, I mean dead from fever. 43rd lost 13, the 56th 10, 64th 11, it just goes on and on and on and on. Most regiments lost their COs to fever. The Royal Navy was hit just as bad. 50 masters of transport vessels perished from the fever, and well over 1,000 of their crewmen. There are no available figures for the Royal Navy for the campaign, but it's probably several thousand Royal Navy men also, because this disease was way more rampant on a closed ship where you couldn't escape. The total number of men lost in this period, I was reading about this the other day, the total losses in the period 1793 to 1798 for the British Army in the West Indies were close to 41,000 dead, about 2,000 deserters, and over 7,000 discharged as being unable to serve. So it's probably about 50,000 men all told.
41,000 dead from disease.
Yeah, and the Royal Navy lost about 13,000, and these are all non-battle casualties. And this is from a relatively small force. But the British Army in the West Indies was never huge. Like, it wasn't 100,000 men, it was like 20,000 men. There's been lots said about why this was so. I think the British troops at that time were not good campaigners. I mean, having read a lot about the Peninsular War, the German regiments, like the 60th Foot in the campaign, lived much better than British troops, because they drank wine, and they collectively got a whole lot of food together and whipped up some interesting cuisine out of it. British troops drank gin or rum and ate boiled beef, right? And they didn't even think to drink water, right? They were marching across these West Indian islands with canteens full of rum. Didn't even think drinking water wasn't even on the agenda. No one even thought that was necessary. And they wondered why guys were dropping dead from heat stroke. And they'd all get into camp and then boiled up a big bit of beef. The French were eating fruit, So... and then once they got into barracks, they were all crammed in together, and the idea of hygiene was not something that was well known then. Yeah, they had a lot to learn about how to campaign, to be honest.
And do you think they did learn, Steve? Have you seen evidence that they did learn lessons?
Yeah, certainly after 1800, the losses were from disease were a lot lower. I think perhaps they were also unfortunate that there seems to have been a particularly rampant strain of yellow fever ripping through the West Indian Islands around that time that perhaps wasn't present later on. And maybe it was a confluence of numerous factors that all allowed it to let loose and carry away, 50,000 men in a couple of years. Yeah. And that's 50,000 men in a period where the total battle deaths would have been less than 10% of that.
Would it be fair to say that in terms of a percentage of those engaged, this was probably the deadliest campaign in British military history?
In terms of the mortality rate for those years, And if you have a look at later campaigns, the only thing that probably comes close to it, just in terms of sheer mortality, is probably Waterloo.
Next to a battle lost, the saddest thing is a battle won.
You know, the 18th of June 1815, there was an extremely high mortality rate, particularly amongst officers. And some regiments, or actions like, you know, the destruction of Colborne's brigade at Albuera, it's probably on a par with that, but they tend to be sort of few and far between. I can't think of any period where literally 50,000 men died in 3 years of natural, well, not natural, but non-battle related causes.
Because, I mean, even if you look at campaigns during the First World War, while the casualty numbers were horrific, as a percentage of those involved, I suspect they weren't quite as high as we're talking about in the West Indies here.
Yeah, you've got to remember, on the First World War, we're talking about huge armies. I mean, the First World War was measured in divisions. BEF having, I don't know what it was, 65 divisions or something on the Western Front at one point. I mean, Grey's force was the equivalent of one division, yeah. Effectively. So the scale is like dramatically different.
Was there a lot of comment on this at the time amongst the rank and file and the officers, just about the fear for their own lives purely from disease? Were they seeing it, and were they understanding what was happening?
You bet. Regiment, that was one of the reasons why recruiting was so hard at this time, because nobody wanted to join a regiment that, you know, 2 weeks after they've joined it, suddenly is aboard a ship heading to the West Indies. It was considered to be a graveyard. In fact, I think it was General William Howe in maybe it was the 1780s or the 1790s, when he was in Parliament, observed that whenever an expeditionary force is sent to the West Indies, they may as well send a regiment of coffin makers to accompany them. And that was a senior general talking.
Yep.
And no one knew how to curtail any of this stuff. They didn't know how to stop it, which is the sad bit. No one thought, hang on a minute, we need to think about hygiene, we need to think about medicine. In British Army terms, that never really happened until the Crimea.
Okay guys, please don't forget to buy Steve's book if you can, and also please don't forget to like and subscribe and leave comments here, as it really helps others to find this show and to spread these fascinating stories of British military history. Alright guys, see you soon.